Chapter 8. Claire Entertains. Claire looked at Violet, stirred out of her pose of aloofness to some degree of sympathy. It occurred to her that perhaps Violet was not trying to be unpleasant, not consciously anyway, about this place they loved so much. Possibly she really wanted to discover the secret of its charm for them. So Claire made an effort to speak Violet's language for once, and forget her own feelings, as much as she could. She said, "I suppose you can't always tell about a place, any more than you can about a person, so long as you are only on the outside. If you lived in Lark's Nest, you'd begin to see how wonderful it is, and how delicious things do keep happening to it, and to us all the time." Violet tucked the powder compact, which she had been using away, into the tiny pocket in the lining of the wrap lying beside her on the sofa, and looked up almost wistfully at Claire, where she stood above her, her face in shadow. "But I want to know what the delicious things are," she urged. "Tell me just one delicious, or even one exciting thing that has happened to you Fays today, not counting your uninvited tea party." And as Claire looked down at her, hesitant and wondering just what she could say, Violet continued, "Oh, go on, Claire, and be a little friendly just for once. What I'm dying to know is what it's all about, what Lark's Nest is about. That is, and you Fays, the way you behave. When any of us drop in on you, we get the impression that you have had to give up some mysterious and thrilling secret life, all your own, in order to be polite to us, and that the minute we take ourselves off, you'll return to your real interest. It is something like that, isn't it? We are merely an interruption to more thrilling pursuits. Yes?" Claire was tricked into sincerity by Violet's apparent sincerity. She answered eagerly, "Yes, oh yes, it is like that. We are so happy, and Lark's Nest, and the woods, and the meadows, and the orchard are all part of it. Why, Lark's Nest is the most wonderful place in the world. We don't need anything or anybody outside." But Violet's eyes, before this speech was half done, had narrowed and hardened. "You are a pleasant child," she affirmed in a tone which left no doubt that she meant it only sarcastically. "So we are a mere interruption always. Nothing more. A friendly lot, I'll say. But I always knew it." Here Bill, her until now wordless attendant, interposed. He had been wandering about the parlor, turning over Rosanna's music on the piano and looking at the book titles on the table. Now he threw down the Atlantic Monthly, which had failed to gain his attention, and exclaimed impatiently to his sister, "Well, why do you insist on nagging at the kid, then, Vi? You only get what you asked for." Claire liked Bill rather. He was older than most of Rosanna's beaux, out of college several years, and just beginning to make something of a name for himself in his profession, the practice of law. He was taking only 2 weeks' vacation this year, and so far no day had passed without his appearance at Lark's Nest. If Rosanna were the marrying sort, then Claire and Rob might have looked at this young man more critically, but as she was not at all likely to fall in love ever again, they had nothing to fear from him, and they liked his hearty laugh and his sense of the ridiculous. Claire felt that now he had come to her rescue, and she was grateful, but Violet had got beyond teasing. Claire had, really though, unintentionally, angered her and wounded her pride. She turned on her brother. "I suppose you like to hear that Rosanna is bored to tears by your arrivals, and rejoiced to pieces at your departures. Well, I don't believe a thing the babe says. She's jealous of the way we take her beloved Rob away from her." "Cheer up, sister. Soon you'll be out yourself, and can go some of the places Rob is invited, perhaps." Claire did not reply. She pretended to be utterly absorbed in a book which she took from the window-sill, and stood turning its pages, reading scraps here and there in a very poor light. She was fortunate in the book she had chanced on. It was Come Hither, a collection of poems made by Walter de la Mare, and a volume cherished and loved beyond most books by the whole family. He that sees blowing the wildwood tree, and peewits circling their watery glass, dreams about strangers that yet may be dark to our eyes, alas. She did not need a decent light to get every last word out of those lines, because she knew them already, as she knew most of the shining pieces of poetry jutting out like mica from de la Mare's notes at the back of this book. This particular gleam was de la Mare's own, and she held to it now with all her heart and concentration. "She's sulking," Violet exclaimed, after a pause which, for some reason or other, had given her back most of her usual animation and good spirits. "Well, don't let us disturb you any longer, sister. Go on with your reading, or whatever game it is you are playing over there by yourself. We won't bother you at all. We'll hang around and amuse ourselves somehow." Bang! Something had fallen to the floor directly above their heads. The noise broke so suddenly and unexpectedly into Violet's flow of words that all three jumped as though it had been a pistol shot. It sounded more like a chair. Knocked over, however. Violet sprang from the sofa, grabbing up her wrap. Now she was no longer tantalizing and teasing. She had had quite enough of Lark's Nest for this evening. "Oh," she exclaimed, "you horrid, horrid family!" She actually stamped her foot. "They are at home all the time. Bill, hiding from us, upstairs, there, giggling and hiding in the dark. Well, this is the last time." Claire was aghast. "How can you?" she cried, as stirred now and uncontrolled as the caller. "How mean of you to think that Rosanna would be so mean. Rosanna! Why, she lets herself be bored by the whole world if it asks her to, and is everlastingly kind and interested. Even Rob's beginning to get that way. You ought to know." At this final outrage, Violet took on the aspect of a stranger, a coldly furious girl whom Claire had never seen before. Who would guess now that she was the possessor of a famous dimple and an almost unvarying vivaciousness? "You "You uncouth kid!" She finally got it out. "You horrid little priggish thing!" "Go easy, V." That was Hester, or somebody tipping over something or other, not Rosanna. I know, Claire's right. Rosanna's too fine altogether for such monkey shines. Bill had come between his sister and Claire, and was holding Violet's cloak wide for her to wrap herself in it. "Hester nothing. Don't I know? She sleeps in the wing. I always said. No, it isn't Hester." Claire upheld Violet. "It couldn't be. It was in the guest room, just overhead. So she must be up, walking around. But it isn't Rosanna, it's only a Dryad." "Oh, heavens!" She clapped her hand over her careless mouth. Too late. Now she had given it away. "I've got to go up and see anyway." But Violet clutched at Claire's dress and held her as she would have gone by. "What do you mean, a Dryad?" she asked, all eager interest now, her suspicions subsiding. Claire stood still, held. "Well, we only think she's a Dryad," she blurted, in her impatience to be gone. "We aren't absolutely certain who or what she is. Now I'm afraid she has fallen out of bed, as she made her escape and plunged up the stairs," she heard Violet exclaim, but laughing, honestly, of all the craziness, and then Bill's responsive, large laugh. But in her very real anxiety about the Dryad, she did not mind their ridicule a bit. With almost trembling hands she picked up the little oil lamp from the table at the head of the staircase, turned up the wick, knocked on the guest room door, and as soon as she heard a feeble "come in," entered, holding the lamp high to take in the whole room. The Dryad was in bed, the spread drawn up to her chin, her dark eyes pathetic in the lamp light. "Oh, Claire," she whispered disappointedly, "I thought it was Rosanna." "Rosana'll be here soon," Claire told her. "She's gone into Four Corners with Rob to try to find some clue to you. But I thought you'd fallen out of bed. What was the noise?" "It was a chair. I tipped it over in the dark. An automobile woke me some time ago. People came in it. The light shone in my window, and I heard you all talking. I got up and went to the window, and stayed there after you'd taken them in, wondering and wondering. Then I was so very tired, I came back to bed, and bumped into the chair. Those people downstairs, those callers, Claire. Did you tell them about me? How I'm up here in bed in your house, and don't know who I am?" Claire was sorry for her. It was too bad that the Dryad should suffer so much from shame at her plight, as though the plight itself could not afford sufficient anxiety. She met the pathetic, dazed eyes with an understanding look. "No, it's all right," she assured the Dryad. "I did blunder just before I came up and said something about not knowing who you were, but I didn't say a word about your not knowing, and you needn't mind a bit what I said, because they didn't believe a word of it. They never do. They just think I'm a silly little girl who goes around talking about things that never were on sea or land. But are you all over being sleepy? Do you want some pillows and a book to read, or a glass of water, or anything. The Dryad shut her eyes. "Your voice is nice, Claire," she murmured. "Of course, I don't remember, but I can't believe that I ever heard such a strange, low voice in my life before. Go on talking. What was that you said?" "That never were on sea or land. There's something lovely in the way you said it. I guess it's the words that are lovely, not the way I speak," Claire explained. "It's out of a poem. The real line is this: 'The light that never was on sea or land.' Do you know the poem?" The pathetic eyes came open and met Claire's almost rebukingly. "Don't ask me if I know or remember things," she begged. "I've been here such hours alone, in the dark, racking my brains until they ache, trying to remember the least, slightest thing. Now I am sleepy again. No, I don't want another pillow. But can't you stay with me? Do you have to go back down there?" "Of course I'll stay. I'll put out the light. Do you like the dark as much as I do? When I was younger, I used to think it was the wings of a mother hen suddenly clapped down over me. The dark, when it came suddenly, by a light being turned off or blown out. I imagined I was a tiny, downy chicken who had nothing at all to be afraid of." After a pause, she added, "Even now that I'm so old, I guess I still pretend sometimes that I'm that chicken and the dark's a wing." The Dryad did not answer or stir under the white spread, and gradually her hand, given so confidingly to Claire's, relaxed. She had fallen asleep, but Claire did not let go her hand. She was glad to stay on, looking out at the stars, wondering whether Violet had been truly angry, or only pretending anger, in order to create excitement, wondering why Rosanna and Rob did not come back, and wondering about that tall, white-black prowler. Gradually she became aware of a sweet breath of perfume, waxing and waning on the air. It did not come in at the windows. There were sweet night smells which did come in at the windows whenever a breeze stirred. Claire could distinguish the different flowers and bushes that gave them forth, but this was different. It came from something in the room itself, delicately distinct, one instant and gone the next. It must come from the Dryad's hair, tossed on the pillow, or from her wispy, unearthly, cobwebby clothes, folded so carefully by Rosanna, on a chair near at hand. Why shouldn't this sweet odor that the Dryad had brought with her be a clue to herself? Perhaps Claire, merely by staying at home, had hit upon a clue that would lead them farther than anything. Rosanna and Rob would learn at Four Corners. She whispered as lightly as the Dryad's breathing, and in rhyme with it. He that sees blowing the wildwood tree, and peewits circling their watery glass, dreams about strangers that yet may be, dark to our eyes, alas. Chapter 9. A Sailor on Deck. It was the next morning. Claire was wandering back and forth between the sides of the lane, gathering a bunch of pink and white clover for the Sunday breakfast table. She was deliberate in her choice of each flower, or appeared to be deliberate, standing sometimes for several seconds or even minutes, gazing fixedly at one before she would pick it. The fact was that she was merely thinking her own thoughts and scarcely seeing the flowers at all. Last night, Violet and Bill had grown tired of waiting for Rosanna and Rob, who were rather late and had gone off noisily, waking the Dryad again. But it was only for an instant. She had found Claire steadily holding her hand, and comforted, she returned at once to her exhausted sleep. It was perplexing to Claire that Rosanna, when she did finally come, had not made more of her quickly given account of the creature who grew from terribly tall to only very tall, and changed from all white to all black before it went spying around Lark's Nest, up the barn ladder, and then back through the gap in the wall to the woods. Why should Rosanna take all that in such a comparatively calm manner? She merely looked at Claire thoughtfully and a little quizzically for the space of a breath after she had finished, and immediately plunged into the tale of how they had failed to bring any more knowledge of the Dryad away from Four Corners than they had taken there, and she seemed more concerned with the fact that they had learned that Dr. Brunell was in Boston and not expected back until the middle of the week than that Lark's Nest had been visited by a prowler and a peeper, no matter what else the creature might prove to be. The real reason for Rosanna's amazing indifference to Claire's evening experience was that Claire had so mixed up her facts with her own impressions of them, throwing in all that about calling to Granny and feeling her arms go around her and thinking the creature was the Dryad's tree coming to look for her, and a good deal more of the same sort, that Rosanna could not precisely tell where any of the action was taking place, whether inside Claire's head or out of it. It was bewildering, and Rosanna, who already had enough bewilderment on her hands in the mere presence of the Dryad asleep in the guest chamber, did not pursue this more elusive variety. It was all I could do, Rob told Claire, to keep Rosanna from giving the whole story away to the Fords. Then what a to-do there would have been. She's agreed to wait over Sunday and give ourselves that length of time to discover something, to save the Dryad from the Fords' publicity. But no longer. So we've got to get busy, Claire, and follow up every clue we can lay our hands on. Did you girls look carefully for markings on her clothes, initials, or even the name of the laundry? Of course I did, Rosanna put in, but there was nothing. They're all made by hand, simply exquisite things, the most delicate silks and gauze. The slippers themselves might have come out of a museum. They are so quaint. They were made to order, that's certain. somebody, somewhere, is frantic with anxiety about what has become of the girl for whom those slippers were made. But why, in the name of reason, why don't they turn up here, looking? It is dead certain that she couldn't have come far, dressed like that, and none of us heard an aeroplane at any time yesterday, did we? Soon they had gone to bed, to sleep on these perplexities, leaving the Dryad's door open in case she should wake and want company. But she did not stir all night. Nobody stirred in the little brown house, or up in the barn. Everybody slept the sleep of well-earned weariness. And now it was Sunday, and Rosanna, Rob, and Pat had gone off to early church, leaving Claire to mind the Dryad again. She would be the one to drive Hester in to 11 o'clock service. Now there was Sunday peace abroad in the world, and time to dawdle and gather clovers. It was funny the way Pat had jumped at the idea of going to church with them when Rosanna offered it, and how curious were the questions that he asked about it. You might think he had never been inside of a church, and was going from the merest curiosity. Claire wondered if they were doing wrong in keeping the truth about the Dryad from Pat, just because the Dryad did not regain her memory at the mention of his assumed name. What did that prove? Nothing at all. And wasn't it reasonable to suppose that where both of them were such mysteries, they might just possibly be able to help clear up each other's? Claire thought so strongly. A faint vibration of the ground warned her of someone approaching. She turned around quickly and was surprised to see a man, a stranger, coming toward her along the grassy lane. It was a sailor. He was of medium height, very much tanned, with crispy brown hair, keen and happy blue eyes, and a sailor's walk. It must be that he had a sailor's walk, or how was it that Claire so instantly spotted him for a sailor? His clothes were no help to her in that deduction, for they were tweed, just ordinary, the sort men wear to business in the city, and the hat swinging in his hand was the usual summer straw. But Claire thought the sea air followed him, here 50 miles from the sea, and the distant sound of surf breaking. Well, granted, it was his walk that told Claire he was a sailor. What was it that made her sure he was Rosanna's sailor? But it was a fact. Even as she returned his frank smile, she was crying to herself, Rosanna's sailors come at last, and now she will get married. After all, glory be. When he reached her, or almost, he sang out, "Good morning." But in her exuberance of gladness for Rosanna, she neglected to answer the salutation. Instead, she burst forth, "You are a sailor, aren't you?" He started and frowned, as though in consternation. He stopped square in front of her, and exclaimed, "Now tell me, please, how you come to know that." Now Claire smiled. "Oh, I just did know, that's all. It was quite easy. But you are older than I thought, older than either Rob or I ever imagined. That might have kept me from knowing, of course. At least, it might have kept me from knowing you are Rosanna's sailor. I'd see you were somebody's sailor, naturally." "I'm sorry I'm older than you thought. That's quite too bad now. I'm 32, and that's pretty serious. But need it make so very much difference? Can't we forget it? Claire stood, the few clovers she had gathered against her chest, regarding him. She was just passingly puzzled, but then things cleared for her. Whether it makes so very much difference will depend on Rosanna, she told him, and then added quickly, but of course it can't make a difference, because she certainly knew all along how old you would be, didn't she? Here she is now. The sailor looked over his shoulder. Rosanna had come up the lane without their having been aware of her approach. Claire cried exultantly, "He's come at last, Rosanna. The sailor is here." Claire, even in the excitement of the minute, was glad and grateful that Rosanna should happen to be looking so particularly beautiful this morning. She had on one of her prettiest summer frocks, and a white hat with a dash of black velvet across one side of the wide brim, beneath which her hair glimmered its buttercup gold. Her expression of gay happiness as she reached them was all that Claire could wish, but her words were confusing disappointment. "What is it, Claire?" she called, and then, when she was quite near, looking at that sailor, "Is it news of the Dryad?" Claire would not abide this pretense. She said, earnestly, "Rosanna, your sailor." Rosanna looked at the sailor, then in a different way, while her eyes grew dark and wide, and a slight blush colored her face. "What's the matter with my sister?" she asked. And then, to Claire's complete consternation, those two introduced themselves to each other. The sailor was a total stranger. Rosanna had never in her life set eyes on him before, but the minute he gave his name, he did not seem a stranger any more, for he was James Kirk, the author of half a dozen novels of sea adventures. In fact, he was Rosanna's favorite modern author, if you could judge by the way she bought each of his books the minute it was off the press, and kept them on a special shelf in her bedroom, bringing them with her from Boston to Lark's Nest every summer. Claire, when she could speak at all, murmured something of this, while Rosanna stood, the red of pleasure and surprise coming and going in her face. "Well, if you aren't the sailor I thought you were, you are a sailor all the same," Claire exclaimed. "It says so on the jackets. Or you were a sailor for years, and you write all your books at sea." The sailor admitted it. Claire could have told him more about himself, much more, for only a few Sundays ago they had read a highly colored account of his adventurous life in the magazine section of a Sunday supplement. If he couldn't be Rosanna's sailor, then he was the next best thing to it, a gentleman with a romantic, glamorous background. But whatever was he doing here, in their lane, at 8 o'clock of a peaceful Sunday morning? They did not ask him, of course, but he told them. It was thrilling news. He had come to look for a boy in whom he was interested, a boy by the name of Pat Donovan, on the chance that he might be somewhere in this neighborhood. Mr. Kirk was just scouting about before breakfast. Rosanna laughed, and if her beauty had not absolutely fixed Mr. Kirk's attention yet, the laugh did, for Rosanna's laugh was like gold and rubies in the absolute preciousness of its quality. Well, at last, she exclaimed, with great contentment, not realizing that Mr. Kirk was looking at her as one waked out of a long sleep. So, one mystery is drawing to its close. We are to get Pat explained anyway. Mr. Kirk pulled himself together. Oh, for just an instant or so he did not realize what the beautiful Miss Fay was saying, but when he remembered the words that had passed in at his ears unnoticed, he looked incredulous. "Don't tell me," he said, "that Pat Donovan, that name, says anything to you." "But of course it does. He's our hired boy." Mr. Kirk shook his head. "I'm sorry, but he couldn't be." He set her right, for he isn't known by that name at all. He'd call himself Norman and never answer to Pat. I don't know why I had forgotten that. "Well, we don't know any Norman, but here comes a Pat, and he says he's Pat Donovan. We punctured a tire down the road, and the boys stayed to fuss with it while I came on. I suppose they couldn't manage, since they're walking. How's our guest, Claire? Still asleep?" Claire nodded and looked with the utmost curiosity from Mr. Kirk to the approaching Pat. There was something peculiarly tense in Mr. Kirk's attention to the boys as they came up. Claire thought he was going paler and paler. Even his tan could not hide that knowledge from her. But Rosanna remained oblivious to Mr. Kirk's strong emotion, and she introduced the boys to him most casually. "This is the only Pat Donovan we know," she added easily, when the introductions were done. "And Pat, this is a famous author of books. Any boy would dote on Mr. James Kirk." But Mr. Kirk was not smiling. There was nothing easy or natural in his manner at all. His face was pale. He had not even acknowledged the introductions. But now he said solemnly, "So you're Pat Donovan." Now Pat was behaving as he had behaved when caught in the woods last evening on his dubious adventure. He spoke defiantly and in a way that would have been rude if it had not been nearer to a sort of princely hauteur. "No, I'm not Pat Donovan. That isn't my real name. But it's as good as any other, and so I took it." The Fays were not surprised at this disclosure. They had assumed all along that Pat had named himself. But Mr. Kirk was surprising. "Pat, believe me," he said, holding out a hand. "That is your name, Pat Donovan." "No, it isn't." "Yes, it is." "No." "Well, it is. The only queer thing about it is how you got it, not knowing it belongs to you." At that, Rosanna and Rob and Claire laughed simultaneously. There was the Dryad up at Lark's Nest, not knowing who she was, and here was Pat, down in the lane, not knowing who he wasn't. "Very well, have it your own way, Mr. Kirk. I want to be called Pat, so there's no argument necessary." "You do want to be called Pat. That's some comfort. Tell me now why you are here and not at Wingate. I suppose you think of yourself as Norman." The Fays gasped. So they were getting warm. Mr. Kirk did have some clue to Pat's identity, but Pat was growing more lordly by the minute. "Are you a policeman or a spy that you have so much curiosity?" he inquired. Mr. Kirk winced oddly. There was no more laughter in his blue eyes, and Claire no longer sniffed the sea tang, or heard far surf breaking. He looked wistful and young. Now nobody would believe he was 32, unless he insisted on it. He said gently, "No, I'm not a spy or a policeman. I'm only your uncle." It was plain that this was news to Pat, and news not credited. "You can't be my uncle," he stated. "I've only got one, and anyway, your insisting that my real name is Pat proves that you don't know much. That never was my name until 3 days ago, so—" After that there was general embarrassment. Mr. Kirk gave up pressing his point, and looked for help to Rosanna, his whole expression troubled. So she took things into her own kind hands, and changed the subject by inviting Mr. Kirk, since he had already told them he had not breakfasted, to breakfast with them at Lark's Nest. And when he quickly accepted, she said to Pat, "Please go up and tell Hester to set another place." Pat escaped gracefully, without a glance toward the disowned uncle. The next thing that happened was Mr. Kirk's proposing that Rosanna walk up and down in the lane with him a bit, while he explained to her what must seem his outlandish behavior to her hired boy. Plainly, just now he wanted a counselor, not general society. So Rob and Claire, of their own accord, withdrew to the house. "I can't bear this suspense," Claire declared, as they reached the front door. "Do you suppose Mr. Kirk is going to be able to clear anything up? Do you suppose he is Pat's real uncle? Why wouldn't Pat acknowledge him?" Rob was as much at sea as Claire. "Let's see if the Dryad's up," he suggested. "Do you suppose he'll claim to be her grandfather?" The Dryad was up, and had wrapped herself in Rosanna's blue dressing gown, which Rosanna had left on the foot of her bed before stealing off to church. She was sitting on the chaise lounge, her bed already made, and the room ordered, so Hester had been here getting acquainted with the Dryad on her own account, while Claire was picking clovers. "May we come in?" Claire called at the door. The Dryad was eager to have them. Hester had wrapped an afghan around the Dryad's knees, and propped pillows at her back. She had not lost her pallor, and the expression of her pathetic face showed them that she had not yet come awake in her memory. Claire went to the window and looked out at Rosanna and the sailor promenading in the lane, deep in conversation, the tilt of their heads, the way they talked. Everything in their attitudes spoke of earnest consultation. Claire sighed with impatience and returned to sit on the foot of the chaise lounge. Rob had drawn up a chair. Now he suddenly reached over and placed something which he had unwrapped from his handkerchief on the wide sleeve of the Dryad's gown. It was a little bright orange newt, a tiny vivid bit of creation, wide awake and glad to be freed. What a find! "I got him down by the road when I was looking for stones to help jack up the car," Rob told the girls. This was the beginning of new things for the Dryad. The pathos vanished from her face, a natural girlish expression of interest, and even glee taking its place. She reached her other hand over and slipped the newt onto her slim palm. Then he crawled, content and unafraid. After a minute, the Dryad laughed. Just merry girlish laughter. For the first time, Claire lost her sense of fairy in connection with their guest. Rob laughed too. Claire herself laughed. Their three heads were bent together over the minute dragon. That is how Hester found them when she appeared with the Dryad's breakfast tray. She had arranged the tray with unusual artistic sense for her. Claire glanced at it and endeavored to conceal her own hunger. There was coffee, hot milk, rolls, marmalade, a tall wine glass full of orange juice, and across the folded white napkin Hester had laid a jolly red clover. They brought the bedside table over and placed it on the left side of the chaise lounge. Then Hester withdrew, backward, looking interestedly at the Dryad until the last. The Dryad's eyes had not lost the light and clarity gained by ordinary laughter. She was delighted with her breakfast, and for the minute carefree. Chapter 10. Failure of Mr. Kirk. When breakfast was ready for the ordinary mortals at Lark's Nest that Sunday morning, it found the mortals more than ready for it, for Hester's pains with the Dryad's breakfast had rather slowed things up in the kitchen. But when finally she did announce the meal, it was one well worth waiting for. A big round bowl of cereal was whisked down before Rosanna for serving the instant they were seated, and before Rob in another instant, a big platter of small brown sausages, oozing an appetizing odor, together with a sister dish of scrambled eggs. Claire called Mr. Kirk's attention to Lazy Susan, poised, ready at their service in the center of the table. Lazy Susan was a circular piece of polished wood that twirled on its pedestal with just the touch of a finger, offering, as you desired them, brown sugar, white sugar, thick cream, thin cream, butter, mustard, and maple syrup. To the north of Lazy Susan, a mountain of toasted brown bread appeared, while to the south towered a dizzy pyramid of hot muffins. Mr. Kirk's hungry and appreciative eyes took in everything, even the big bowl of sugared doughnuts on the serving table between the windows. No, the Fays were not a family of gluttons. They were merely early risers, and the possessors of health, and fortunately, the means for nourishing health. Lazy Susan fascinated Mr. Kirk. In all my travels, this is the first time I have met the lady, he assured the Fays, as he sat observing her delightedly, and forgetting to unfold his napkin. It's a great invention, Rosanna responded, and twirled the thing gently until the chunky blue pitcher of thick cream together with its matching bowl of brown sugar made their bow directly before Mr. Kirk's plate. Or would you rather have maple syrup on your porridge? Rosanna inquired politely. Claire and Rob like that better. Why can't I have 'em all brown sugar, cream, and maple syrup? Is there enough? Oh, heaps. Mr. Kirk accepted her word for the heaps and acted on it. Then he looked across Lazy Susan into Rosanna's eyes. "Pat's in the kitchen?" he asked in a low voice. She put her finger to her lips and nodded her head toward the screen behind which the kitchen door stood ajar. Then she said in a natural tone, "I quite agree with you, Mr. Kirk. It wouldn't be a good day for fishing, too bright." So Claire and Rob had to reconcile themselves again to waiting some time longer for any explanation of Mr. Kirk's claims to unclehood, which were to be vouchsafed them. Everything was talked about at that breakfast except the two subjects that really mattered, the Dryad and the hired boy. Mr. Kirk's books were discussed, the inn at Four Corners, and its landlord, Rosanna's Girl Scout troop in Boston. She was a captain. The golf course at Crescent Lake, Rob's school, Claire's school, Hester's dreams of the night before, recounted with zest and detail as she passed the doughnuts. The absent Caesar, whose favorite food was sausages, everything, anything, except Pat and the Dryad. Claire wondered whether Mr. Kirk knew of the Dryad's existence in the house. As they rose from the table, Mr. Kirk said, "Now let's see about that puncture. Pegaway's down on the road, isn't he?" He admitted that he had never had a car of his own, and never yet had occasion to doctor a puncture, but he was confident of his ability all the same. In a body, then, the breakfast party adjourned to the State Road, but almost before they were in the lane, Rob's and Claire's hopes of even now learning anything about Pat were dashed. Mr. Kirk, the minute they were outside the house, said to Rosanna in a rather decided manner, "Let's keep all I have told you to ourselves, shall we, until I can come to some understanding with Mr. Titus. I'll get right along to Wing Gate the minute we've patched up the tire." "We'll drive you, of course," Rosanna offered. "No, thank you. I'd like the exercise. I think after that rather amazing breakfast of Hester's. And you don't want, before you go, just to speak to the Dryad?" "I don't believe so, not till I come back with something definite accomplished. But you'd better see that Pat doesn't get onto her, don't you think? I'd like to be around myself when that comes off." Rosanna nodded silently, perfectly acquiescent. "But see here," Rob exclaimed, as though such injustice could not be. "You're going to tell Claire and me who Pat is, and why he wouldn't own you for an uncle, and who the Dryad is, if you know, aren't you?" "Why, Claire and I are in on this as much as Rosanna, every bit." "It's rough to have to wait, I know," Mr. Kirk replied, but looking perfectly firm about it all the same. "It'll be only a few hours you'll have to contain yourselves, though." Then he turned to Rosanna again, and spoke while the other two drank in, and made as much out of every word as they could. "I'll reason with Titus, and if necessary, his accompanying genie, too. When I've got something fixed up there, I'll then go on to the inn, dine, and get that picture, returning here early in the afternoon. There's no frightful hurry, now we've got so far." "Of course, I'll have to win them, I don't forget that." Again, the wistful, hurt look which had first appeared in his encounter with Pat returned to the sailor's face. If it had not been for that wistful expression, Claire and Rob would certainly have pressed their claims for information at this point with more vigor. But how could they when they realized from Mr. Kirk's whole manner that the mystery of Pat and the mystery of the Dryad were no mere mysteries to him, but something of more consequence, something pretty important in his life? Anyway, Claire congratulated herself. She had been right, and the Dryad was something to Pat, and Pat to the Dryad. The tire did get fixed with remarkable speed, and Rob had to acknowledge that Mr. Kirk had made good his boast to a practical turn of hand. Then Mr. Kirk was off, swinging along down the road toward the turn that would, in the course of half an hour or so, bring him to the iron wings, guarding the approach to Wing Gate. The Fays stood watching him out of sight before they piled into Pegaway for the jog up to the barn. Rosanna had said, the minute Mr. Kirk was out of earshot, "Now please don't tease me, or try to find out anything, girls and boys. He does know all about Pat, who he is, and where he came from. And he knows all about the Dryad, too. He knows more than they know themselves, I believe. But it isn't going to be plain sailing for him. He has a difficult time ahead before he can straighten things out here. He's right in the middle of a real adventure, more exciting than any book he ever wrote. That's every word I can tell you, for I've promised him. Be good sports. I'm sorry." But as they got down out of Pegaway, up in the barn, Claire angled for one crumb of information more. "So the Dryad isn't a Dryad. She's just a girl." Rosanna laughed, but of course she consented to toss the crumb. "Didn't I tell you last night that everything would ultimately have a naturalistic explanation? It always does. Even your policeman affair had. Poor Caesar thought so anyway." "Are you going to tell Hester as much as you've told us?" Rob inquired. "You tell her I'm going for a walk to Berry Pond and won't be back till dinner. I sort of feel like a run alone. But how soon do you think Mr. Kirk will come back?" Claire called as Rosanna started toward the fields. "Rather early, I shouldn't wonder. Anything more?" She had stopped and turned. Claire gave her sister a penetrative look. "I shouldn't wonder either," she exclaimed, with meaning in her tone. Rosanna came back, close up to Claire. Rob had already gone into the kitchen to tell Hester the story so far as it had now progressed. "Well, Claire," Rosanna asked, "why so solemn? It's really going to be a great day. I've never been so thrilled. Don't turn into an owl, darling, right here in the backyard. That would be a touch too much of magic, even for Lark's Nest." "Well, I don't mind looking owlish," Claire said sadly. "I feel it. Rosanna, tell me just one thing more, will you? If I can. I hate all this secrecy as much as you do. Could you fall in love with any other sailor after that first one you loved so much? Could you change like that? Are you crazy? What first sailor? The one Father told us about. The one you were in love with when you came back from the South Seas. Your first deep love. The reason you don't fall in love with any of your own crowd. Are you beginning to forget that sailor?" Rosanna did not laugh, but it was only her natural tact that kept her from it, for inside she was rocking with merriment. But she said with sincerity, "I think father is a mean old thing to feed you on such trash, Claire. He was just teasing. If he said I had fallen for a sailor, just one of his yarns, that nobody is supposed to take seriously, I should think you and Rob would know by now not to let him bamboozle you. So it was just father. You never were in love before." Rosanna suddenly forgot that she wanted to laugh. She put a hand on Claire's shoulder. A kind light in her face. She must make up somehow to the child for this disappointment in the loss of an apparently pleasant dream. "No, darling," she replied honestly. "I have never been in love before." And the minute she had said it, she realized how Claire had tricked her, without meaning to, into that fatal word, before. The sisters looked startled, deep into each other's eyes, while Claire went a little pale, and Rosanna went very red. Then they both laughed, and turned away from each other. But Claire thought she had never loved Rosanna so much before. There was no difficulty in keeping Pat and the Dryad from knowledge of each other, in accordance with Mr. Kirke's desire, for the hired boy had used his Sunday holiday to vanish, informing Hester rather royally that he would not be back for dinner. But even with Pat out of the way, Rosanna encouraged the Dryad to remain upstairs, resting on the Chase lounge. It was wiser in case of chance Sunday callers. It caused Claire a queer little pang to see the humbly submissive way the Dryad gave in to Rosanna's least suggestion for her. She did not want to stay in one room, and she did not want to stay on the Chase lounge. She was feeling perfectly well now, and interested in all that went on at Lark's Nest, but she merely looked disappointed and wistful when she was told what to do, and did not question Rosanna's authority. Early in the afternoon, when the Fays and Hester were beginning to expect Mr. Kirke's return, and watch for it, other callers came instead, not particularly welcome callers. They were Violet and Bill, who had driven over from Crescent Lake to describe the hick dance, which Rosanna and Rob had missed the night before, and to inject a bit of real news into the quiet atmosphere of Lark's Nest. Violet got ahead of her brother with it. "Oh, Rosanna, you'll be so thrilled. Even I am a little thrilled. Mr. Kirke, your own James Kirke, the author, is staying at the Four Corners Inn. Dave Johnston was at the dance and told me. Dave Johnston was the proprietor of the Four Corners Inn. You've got to lend me one of his books today, right off. I want to sound intelligent when I meet him. Mother is going to get an introduction through Miss Van Wyck and give a luncheon and ask him to read. It's the last book I should like. Please, the one published this spring." Claire was not surprised when Rosanna merely agreed that the news was interesting, and refrained from mentioning the fact that the celebrity had breakfasted with them this very morning, and was expected now at any minute to return to Lark's Nest. Rosanna was like that. unless she was directly asked. She was likely to tell very little, and today, as usual, Violet's exuberance had the effect of intensifying her reserve. As for Claire herself, she had not the slightest temptation to make Violet envious of their acquaintance with Mr. Kirk. When let alone, she either became completely dumb on Violet's entrance into her environment, or else vanished. She chose to vanish now, slipping off through the dining room and out of the kitchen door for a walk in the direction of Four Corners. As she passed under the Dryad's window, she heard Rob's voice, and deduced from its rhythm that he was reading aloud to the Dryad. Pausing to listen, she caught some of the words, and discovered that it was Mr. Kirk's last book they were sharing. So what about Violet's borrowing it? Claire had another motive for her solitary tramp than the desire to escape from Violet. She hoped against hope to meet up with Pat somewhere on the road, but she was disappointed. She saw no one that she knew at all in the time she was gone, until on her return toward 4 o'clock, she suddenly noticed Hester standing at the center of the swirl of young birch trees down in the corner of the field, bordering Lark's Nest Orchard, not far from the road. Happily, Claire negotiated the rail fence, the only thing that separated her from her friend, and stole upon her. But Hester was neither surprised nor startled by the intrusion on what appeared to be, but was not, her solitude. Claire never startled anybody. Anyway, she was as gentle in her comings and goings as a summer breeze, or the shadows of clouds, or birds when they hop across the grass. At any rate, this was the way Hester often put it to herself. If she were required to speak aloud on the subject, she would probably say, "Claire's not a girl for pouncing." So now she looked up and said right off, not wasting breath on unessentials in the meeting, "I was sort of visitin' here with these trees, Claire, tellin' 'em Rosanna says the Dryad ain't a Dryad any more but a real girl, and that Mr. Kirk's goin' to give us sensible explanations for the whole kit and boodle when he comes. But they don't seem so sure, these birches, and they make me not so sure. We think, among us, that no matter how much explaining gets done, there'll be something anyway left for you and me and Rob to puzzle about yet. Explaining may fool Rosanna and Mr. Kirk. I shouldn't wonder, but it ain't so easy to fool trees. They feel, just like me, that there's something mysterious in the air around here that ain't so easy to clear up that just a passing sailor man's goin' to do it." Claire was in perfect accord with Hester and the trees in this matter, but her thoughts for the minute were practical. "So he hasn't come back yet, Mr. Kirk? Have the Janices gone?" "Oh yes, they've gone, since before my dishes got done, but there's no sign of the sailor, and Rosanna's beginning to act restless." Hester was correct in her observation about Rosanna. When Claire got to the house, Rosanna rather seized upon her, as though glad of company in restlessness. "Sit down with me here on the step," she urged, "and help watch. I did expect him really early. You heard him say he'd come early yourself, didn't you, Claire?" Rob was continuing to read to the Dryad from Kirk's latest novel, which Rosanna had not asked him to give up to Violet. substituting an earlier one in its stead. They were just coming to the closing, exciting chapters, and were so absorbed that speeding time and the delay of the author's return did not matter to either of them a bit. When, for the 10th time or so since Claire's return, Rosanna went in from the front steps, where they were waiting together, to stare at the face of the clock in the parlor, and saw that now it was very nearly 6 o'clock, her impatience melted into something even more uncomfortable, anxiety. When she came out and sat down this time, Claire noticed that the eyes that she turned back to the lane had taken on a strained, almost a pleading expression. Then suddenly, and with no warning to speak of, a thunderstorm rolled out from the east over Tanglewood. All in a minute, the golden Sabbath afternoon was golden no longer, but windy, gray, and several waves of Rosanna's buttercup hair whipped themselves from their confining pens and beat about her face. Claire's curls, always balancing a little on air, fairly galloped now, and the girls' light summer dresses ballooned about their knees. "It's going to rain," Rosanna exclaimed, tucking her hair behind her ears and planting the pens with new firmness. "I'll say it is," Claire exulted. Thunder showers always made her happy, even happier than her ordinary happiness. The oncoming of a storm, such as this one, promised to be stirred her roots, as she imagined it stirred the roots of the grass and the flowers and the trees. The ground, as well as the air, was alive with expectation. She knew it. "But will he come if it rains?" Rosanna begged, her voice pitched above the wind. She wanted Claire to say yes, he would, and Claire complied by calling out truthfully, "He isn't the sort of person to be scared by any old storm. I guess, of course he'll come." Rob had been waked to the approach of the storm a little in advance of the girls, and he was rushing around upstairs, banging down all the windows toward the east, goaded to haste by Hester's calling from the kitchen, where she was attending to those, and the dining-room windows, that it would be here in a minute. She could hear it hissing through the trees, over in Tanglewood already. Rob was as efficient upstairs as Hester had been downstairs. When all was safe, he crossed to Rosanna's room, where he leaned from the window and shouted down to the girls still idling on the doorstep. "I've an idea. What do you bet Violet's captured Kirk, and he's having tea there? She's a fast worker, Violet." Rosanna paid no attention to him. She got up and went into the house. Claire waited an instant more for the expected first splashes of rain on her open palms and lifted face. But there were no first splashes. The storm came out of Tanglewood and over the wall on thundering hoofs. She heard it pounding along the roof and dashed inside just in the nick of time. She felt to escape being beaten suddenly down by it, like the grass in the dooryard. Rob joined her in the parlor, and they exulted together, standing close to the open windows, drinking deep breaths of the joyous air that comes with such a storm, and watching the silver spray of light along the ground where the rain soaked hardest. Rosanna had gone into the kitchen. Hester looked up from the table where she was sitting to mix a batch of popovers for their favorite Sunday night supper. "Didn't Mr. Kirk get here ahead of the storm?" she inquired with some concern. "He'll get a wetting." Rosanna stood for a minute staring out of the window against which the rain streamed, shutting off the garden and the barn. When she finally brought her eyes to Hester and woke to her words, she shook her head. "He didn't come. Perhaps he isn't coming. Hester, I can't tell the children. We mustn't let the children in on it yet, not until it's certain. But if Mr. Kirk could have come this afternoon, he would have, just as he promised. He's that sort." "I thought the same myself," Hester replied, before returning to her spirited combat with the popover batter. But as she began to beat away, she added in a sterner tone, "He could have come if he had wanted to. Of Rosanna, what'd hinder?" As she spoke, and while the wooden spoon flew, Hester noticed with some surprise the queer look on Rosanna's usually composed features. But even so, Rosanna's next words took her totally by surprise, and made her lose her grip on the spoon. "I suspect that something has happened to Mr. Kirk. I suspect that there has been foul play."